Nationalism and Economic Development, 1816 to 1848. The election of James Monroe as president in 1816, less than 2 years after the Battle of 1812, inaugurated what one newspaper editorial characterized as an era of good feelings. The term gained wide currency and was later adopted by historians to describe Monroe's 2 terms in office. The era of good feelings. The period's nickname suggests that Monroe years were marked by a spirit of nationalism, optimism, and goodwill. In some ways, they were. One party, the Federalists, into oblivion, and Monroe's party. The Democratic Republicans adopted some of their policies and dominated politics. This perception of unity and harmony, however, can be misleading and oversimplified. Throughout the era, people had heated debates over tariffs, the national bank, internal improvements, and the public land sales. Sectional tensions over slavery were booming, more and more apparent. More of a sense of political unity was illusory, since antagonistic factions within Democratic Republicans would soon split into 2. The actual period of good feelings would have only lasted from 1816 to the Panic of 1812. So while some people see the era of good feelings an actual time of peace and political peace, there were still a lot of debates, such as slavery, that existed. James Monroe. As a young man, Monroe had fought in the Revolutionary War and suffered through the Valley Forge winter. He had become a prominent Virginian politician and served as Jefferson's minister to Great Britain and as Madison's Secretary of State. He continued the Virginia dynasty of the first 5 presidents. 4 were from Virginia. The other, Adams, was from Massachusetts. In the election of 1816, Monroe defeated the Federalist king, Rufus King, overwhelmingly, 183 electoral votes to 34. By 1812, the Federalist Party had practically vanished, and Monroe received every electoral vote except 1. With no organized political opposition, Monroe represented the growing nationalism of American people. Under Monroe, the country acquired Florida, agreed on the Missouri Compromise, and adopted the Monroe Doctrine. So 3 things you want to make sure you know: Monroe Doctrine, Missouri Compromise, and of course, the acquisition of Florida. Cultural nationalism. The popular votes for James Monroe were cast by a younger generation of Americans whose concerns differed from those of the nation's founders. The young were excited about the prospects of a new nation expanding westward and had little interest in European politics now that the Napoleonic Wars were in the past. As fervent nationalists, they believed their young country was entering an era of unlimited prosperity. Patriotic themes infused every aspect of American society, from art to school books. Heroes of the Revolution were enshrined in paintings by Gilbert Stuart, Charles Willson Peale, and John Trumbull. A fictionalized biography extolling the virtues of George Washington, written by Parson Mason Weems, was widely read. The expanding public schools embraced Noah Webster's blue-backed speller, which promoted patriotism long before his famous dictionary was published. The basic ideas and ideals of nationalism and patriotism would dominate in the 19th century. So you're getting this idea of cultural nationalism that exists, pride, American pride, and I guess you could say in the arts and the cultures, as mentioned through the works of some of the authors as well as the paintings above. You're also getting economic nationalism. Parallel with cultural nationalism was a political movement to support the growth of the nation's economy. Subsidizing internal improvements was one aspect of the movement. Protect budding U.S. industries from European competition was a second aspect. Tariff of 1816. Before the War of 1812, Congress had levied low tariffs on imports as a method for raising government revenue. Then, during the war, manufacturers erected many factories to supply goods that previously had been imported from Britain. Now, in peacetime, these American manufacturers feared that British goods would be dumped on American markets and take away from much of the business. Congress raised tariffs for the express purpose of protecting U.S. manufacturers from competition. This was the first protective tariffs in U.S. history, with the First Amendment comes. Tariff of 1816, in order to protect U.S. Manufactured goods and factories that came to existence during the early to 1800s because of British impressment and as well as French stopping trade routes. America needed to now protect American manufacturers, right? They didn't want people to trade too much with Britain and France. New England, with little manufacturing at the time, was the only section to oppose the higher tariffs. Even the Southwest, which had opposed tariffs in the past, would oppose them in the future. They generally supported the 1816 tariff, believing that it was needed for national prosperity. Henry Clay's American System. Henry Clay of Kentucky, a leader in the House of Representatives, proposed a comprehensive method for advancing the nation's growth. His plan, which he called the American System, consists of three parts. Number one, protective tariffs. Number two, a strong national bank, and three, internal improvements. Clay argued that the protective tariffs would promote American manufacturing and also raise revenue, which had to build a national transportation system of federally constructed roads and canals. A national bank would keep the system running smoothly by providing a national currency. The tariffs would chiefly benefit the East. Internal improvements would promote the West and the South, and the bank would aid the economies of all sections. So Henry Clay, you need to know for the American system, protect American business through tariffs, have a strong national bank that could go ahead and fund internal improvements such as roads and canals. Two parts of Clay's systems were already in place in 1816. The last year of James Madison's presidency, Congress in that year adopted a protective tariff and also chartered the Second National Bank of the United States. So Henry Clay was successful with the first two, the bank and the tariff. On the matter of internal improvements, however, both Madison and Monroe objected that the Constitution did not explicitly provide for the spending of federal money on roads and canals. Throughout his presidency, Monroe consistently vetoed acts of Congress providing funds for road building and canal building. Thus, the individual states were left to make internal improvements on their own. So we kind of felt here that the creation of these public projects should be done at the state level, not the federal level. So that's why it didn't necessarily happen. The Panic of 1819. The era of good feelings was fractured in 1819 by the first major financial panic since the Constitution had been ratified. The economic disaster was largely the fault of the Second Bank of the United States, which had tightened credit in belated effort to control inflation. Many state banks closed, and unemployment, bankruptcies, and imprisonment for debt increased sharply. The Depression was most severe in the West, where many people were in debt because they speculated on land during the post-war euphoria. In 1819, the Bank of the United States foreclosed on large amounts of Western land, farmland that is. As a result of the bank and depression, nationalistic beliefs were shaken. In the West, the economic crisis changed many voters' political outlook. Westerners began calling for land reform and expressing strong opposition to both the national and debtors' prisons. So a couple things you want to understand is you can the Panic of 1819 that kind of fractures the era of good feelings, that kind of lowers the nationalism that was meant before. And the reason why this ends up happening was the bank foreclosed in large amounts of Western land, was that they thought the investments would be better than they actually were. Political changes. A principal reason for the rapid decline of the Federalist Party was its failure to adapt to the changing needs of a growing nation. Having opposed the War of 1812 and presided over a sections convention at Hartford, the party seemed completely out of step with the nationalist temperament of the times. After its crushing defeat in the election of 1816, it ceased to be a national party and failed to nominate a president in 1820. So remember, that party fails as a result of the Hartford Convention. Changes in the Democratic-Republican Party. Meanwhile, the Democratic-Republican Party is the only remaining political party underwent serious national strains as it adjusted to changing times. Members such as John Randolph clung to the old party ideals of limited government and strict interpretation of the Constitution. Most members, however, adopted what had once been Federalist ideas, such as the need for maintaining a large army and navy and support for a national bank. Some members reversed their views from one decade to the next. For example, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts strongly opposed both the tariffs of 1816 and 1824, but then supported higher tariffs in 1828. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina was another Democratic-Republican leader who reversed positions. An outspoken war hawk and nationalist 1812, Calhoun championed states' rights after 1828. So what this is saying is, although the Federalist Party is dead, as mentioned, some of these people, the Democratic-Republican Party, would start taking on Federalist views. Political factions and several and sectional differences became more intense during Monroe's second term. When Monroe, honoring the two-term tradition, declined to be candidate again, 4 other Republicans sought election as president in 1824. How the selection split of the Democratic-Republican Party, which led to the emergence of 2 rival parties, which we'll talk about in Chapter 10. So next we need to talk about Marshall Supreme Court, central and government powers. One Federalist official continued to have major influence throughout the years of Democratic-Republican ascendancy, John Marshall. He had been appointed the Supreme Court, the head of the Supreme Court in 1800 by Federalist President John Adams, and was still leading the court as its Chief Justice. His decisions consistently favored the federal government and the rights of property against the advocates of states' rights. Even when justices appointed by Democratic Republicans, presidents formed a majority on the court, they often sided with Marshall because they were persuaded by the U.S. Constitution that it created a federal government with strong and flexible powers. Several of Marshall's decisions became landmarking rulings that defined the relationship between the central government and the states. The first of these three cases was Marbury versus Madison, which established judicial review and also described in Chapter 7. Six others are described below. So you need to understand that during this era of good feelings, you're getting kind of more power, and not necessarily more power, but some major decisions that were put in place by the Supreme Court. Fletcher versus Peck. In the case involving land fraud in Georgia, Marshall concluded that a state could not pass legislation invalidating a contract. This is the first time the Supreme Court declared a state law to be unconstitutional and invalid. So it's kind of limiting states' rights. Martin versus Hunter's lease. The Supreme Court established that it had jurisdiction over state courts in cases involving constitutional rights. It's basically saying that the Supreme Court is the highest court. Dartmouth versus Woodward. This case involved a law of New Hampshire that changed Dartmouth College from a privately chartered college into a public institution. The Marshall Court struck down the state law as unconstitutional, arguing that the contract for a private corporation could not be altered by the state. So saying that in general, once again, that the state does not have the right to alter contracts. McCullough versus Maryland is an important one that you want to know. Maryland attempted to tax the second bank of the United States located in Maryland. Marshall ruled that a state could not tax a federal institution because the power to tax is the power to destroy, and federal laws are Supreme Court over state laws. In addition, Marshall settled the long-run debate over constitutionality of the National Bank. Using a loose interpretation of the Constitution, Marshall ruled that even though no clause in the Constitution specifically mentions a national bank, the Constitution gave the federal government the implied power to create one. So it's saying that the federal bank is constitutional and the states do not have the power to tax it. Cohens versus Virginia. A pair of brothers named Cohens were convicted in Virginia illegally selling lottery tickets for a lottery authorized by Congress. While Marshall and the court upheld the conviction, they established the principle that the Supreme Court could review a state's court's decisions involving any powers of the federal government. Gibbons versus Ogden, another very important one. Could the state of New York grant a monopoly in the steamboat company if the action conflicted with the charter authorized by Congress? In ruling, the New York monopoly was unconstitutional. Marshall established that the federal government's broad control of interstate commerce. So it's basically saying that the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce. Next, we need to understand the Western Settlement and Missouri Compromise. Less than 10 years after the start of the War of 1812, the population west of the Appalachian Mountains had doubled. Much of the nationalistic and economic interest in the country was centered on the West, which presented both opportunities and new questions. So as people are moving westward, we need to understand there's going to be a lot of issues that come into mind. Reasons for westward movement. So these are why people would go west. Several factors combined to stimulate rapid growth along the western frontier during the presidencies of Madison and Monroe. Acquisition of American and Indians' lands. Large areas were open for settlement after American Indians were driven from their lands by the victories of General William Henry Harrison in the Indian Territory and Andrew Jackson in Florida and South. So both presidents in the future, William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson, they had these victories over Native American tribes, which granted us territory. Economic pressures. The economic difficulty to the northeast from the embargo and the war caused people from this region to seek a new future across the Appalachians. In the South, tobacco planters needed new land to replace the exhausted years of poor farming methods. Found good land for planting cotton in Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. So people wanted to move westward because plantation farming had ruined their land, so they needed more land. Improved transportation. Pioneers had an easier time reaching the frontier as a result of the building of roads and canals, steamboats, and railroads. Westward expansion was because of better technology. Immigrants. More Europeans were being attracted to America by speculators offering cheap land in the Great Lakes region and the valleys of Ohio, Cumberland, and Mississippi rivers. So immigration was another one. New questions and issues. Despite the rapid growth in new states of the West had small populations relative to those of other two sections. To enhance their limited political influence in Congress, Western representatives bargained with politicians from other sections to obtain their objectives. Of the greatest importance to the Western states were cheap money from the states rather than from the Bank of the United States, low prices for land sold by the federal government and improved transportation. However, on the critical issue of slavery, Westerners would not agree whether or not to permit it or exclude it. Those settling territory to the South wanted slavery for economic reasons, while those settling in the North were just against slavery. In 1819, the Missouri Territory applied to Congress for statehood. The slavery issue became a subject for angry debate. So there were some things that people agreed to. So, of course, the one thing that they disagreed on is just the expansion of slavery. As they moved west, and states would apply for statehood, there would be debate on whether these states would be slavery or free. So this leads us to the Missouri Compromise. Ever since 1791 to 1792, when Vermont entered the Union as a free state and Kentucky entered as a slave state, politicians in Congress had attempted to preserve a sectional balance between the North and the South. Keeping a balance in the House of Representatives was difficult because population in the North was growing more rapidly than in the South. By 1818, the northern states had a majority of 105 to 81 in the House. However, in the state, the votes remained divided evenly, 11 slave and 11 free states. As long as the balance was preserved, Southern senators could block legislation that they believed threatened the interests of the section. Missouri's bid for statehood alarmed the North because slavery was well established there. If Missouri came in as a slave state, it would tip the political balance in the South's favor. Furthermore, Missouri was in part of the Louisiana Purchase to apply for statehood. Southerners and Northerners alike worried about the future status of other new territories applying for statehood from the vast Louisiana Purchase. So this is a huge political concern that we're getting here. As more states that we've acquired through the Louisiana Purchase are applying for statehood, it's going to cause an imbalance in Congress between slave and free states. So we get the Talmadge Amendment. Representatives James Talmadge from New York ignited debate about the Missouri question by proposing an amendment to the Bill of Missouri's admission. The amendment called for 1, prohibiting the further introduction of slaves into Missouri, and 2, required the children of Missouri slaves to be emancipated at the age of 25. If adopted, the Talmadge Amendment would have led to the gradual elimination of slavery in Missouri. The amendment was defeated in Senate and enraged Southerners and saw it as a first step in Northern effort to abolish slavery in all states. So this Talmadge Amendment, of course, it's put in by House of Representative James Talmadge from New York. It's calling for a couple things. Number one, it's prohibit the further introduction of slaves into Missouri. So no more slaves come into Missouri, and also require that children of Missouri slaves to be free after the age of 25. So it's basically saying that slavery is going to be gradually phased out. The South sees this as a threat because they see this as a threat of Northerners of trying to end slavery. And remember, the Southern economy was very much reliant on that. So Henry Clay has a couple of proposals. After months of heated debate in Congress and throughout the nation, Henry Clay won a majority support for 3 bills that, taken together, represent a compromise. Number one, admit Missouri as a slave-holding state, and they would admit Maine as a free state. So that goes ahead and sets the balance. However, they would also prohibit slavery in the rest of Louisiana Territory north of latitude 3630. So in other words, what we end up getting is everything north of the Missouri Compromise line, 3630, which you see right here, would be a would be a free state. Everything south of it would be a slave state. And then Missouri would be slave, Maine would be free. Sorry, guys. Which, of course, then keeps that balance. So here's the aftermath of it. Sectional feelings on the slavery issue subsided after 1820. The Missouri Compromise preserved the sectional balance for more than 30 years. Nevertheless, if an era of good feelings existed, it was badly damaged by the storm of sectional controversy over Missouri. After this political crisis, Americans were torn between feelings of nationalism on one hand and feelings of sectionalism on the other. So this is going to lead to more sectionalism tensions. So, for example, what this means is that people don't know to swear allegiance to the North, South, or to America as a whole. So there are going to be rising sectional tensions in regards to slavery. So foreign affairs. Following the War of 1812, the United States adopted a more aggressive nationalistic approach with other nations. During Madison's presidency, when problems in the Barbary Pirates again developed, a fleet under Stephen Decatur was sent in 1815 to force the rulers of North Africa to follow American shipping and the free use of the Mediterranean. President Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams continued to follow a nationalistic policy to actively advance American interests while maintaining peace. Canada. Although a treaty of Ghent in 1814 ended the war between Britain and the United States, it left unresolved most of their diplomatic differences, including many involving Canada. So we're getting a lot of issues with Canada during this time. We have the Rush-Bagot Agreement, 1817. During Monroe's first year as president, Britain and American negotiators agreed to a major disarmament pact. The Rush-Bagot Agreement strictly limited naval armament on the Great Lakes. In the time, the agreement was extended to place limits on border fortifications as well. Ultimately, the border between the United States and Canada was to become the longest unfortified border in the world. So what we're getting is the border of Canada and also the area of the Great Lakes. They're basically saying that we're disarming, right? So there's a lot of dispute on what that border is. Treaty of 1818. Improved relations between the United States and Britain continued in a treaty that provided shared fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, joint occupation of the Oregon Treaty for 10 years, and 3, the settling Oregon Territory for 10 years and the settling of northern limits of Louisiana Territory in the 49th parallel, thus establishing the western U.S. boundary line. So a couple things that we end up getting here is shared fishing rights in the coast of Newfoundland that Britain merchants or Britain fishers and American fishers would accept each other, right? And then you're also getting the Oregon Territory. It was undisputed territory. So what this means is that they're actually just going to share the territory for 10 years. We will get a lot more Americans than British that would move over there. And then they would go ahead and establish, finally, that border of what would be Canada and would be the U.S., and that would be the 49th parallel. During the War of 1812, U.S. troops had occupied western Florida, a strip of land gulf, Mexico, extending all the way to the Mississippi Delta. Previously, this land between had been held by Spain, Britain's ally. After the war, Spain had difficulty governing the rest of Florida because its troops had been removed from Florida to battle revolts in the South American colonies. The chaotic conditions permitted groups of Seminoles, runaway slaves, and white outlaws to conduct raids in U.S. territory and to retreat to safety across the Florida border. These borders gave Monroe and General Andrew Jackson an opportunity to take a military action in Spanish Florida, a territory long coveted for American expansionists. So Florida had a lot of instability. So what we end up getting is you're getting a lot of Native Americans that are going there. You're also getting a lot of slaves that are running away there. So it's just a lot of chaotic things. So you're getting outlaws that are conducting raids in U.S. territories. So a lot of things that are just, or a lot of outlaws are fleeing to Florida. Sorry. So Andrew Jackson has agreed to, of course, go ahead and invade. Jackson's military campaigns. In late 1817, the President commissioned General Jackson to stop the raiders and, if necessary, pursue them across the border into Spanish West Florida. Jackson carried out his orders with a vengeance and probably went beyond his instructions. In 1818, he led a force of militia in Florida, destroyed Seminole villages, and hanged 2 Seminole chiefs. Capturing Pensacola, Jackson drove out the Spanish governor and hanged 2 British traitors accusing of aiding the Seminoles. Many members of Congress feared that Jackson's overzealousness would precipitate a war with both Spain and Britain. However, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams persuaded Monroe to support Jackson, and the British decided not to intervene. So Andrew Jackson, he goes ahead and he invades Florida, kills some Seminole Native Americans, and he even hangs 2 British people of supporting them. We fear that his violence is going to lead us to war with Britain and Spain. It doesn't, though. In fact, it leads to the Florida Purchase Treaty. In 1819, Spain, worried that the United States would seize Florida, preoccupied with troubles in Latin America, decided to get the best possible terms for Florida. So they figured that, hey, we might actually, that the Americans are going to obtain it, so why not just sell it to them rather than just losing in a war. Spain turned over all of its possessions to Florida and all its claims and Oregon victory to the United States. In exchange, the United States agreed to assume $5 million in claims against Spain and give up any U.S. territorial claims to the Spanish province of Texas. The agreement is also called the Adams-Onis Treaty. So this is one thing that you want to make sure that you know. In general, we buy Spain. And then however, we agree that we will respect their Texas border. The Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine. Although focused on its own growth, the United States did not ignore the ambitions of Europe in the Western Hemisphere. The restoration of a number of monarchies in Europe with the fall of Napoleon in 1812 produced a backlash against Republican movements. Restored monarchies in France, Austria, and Prussia, together with Russia, worked to suppress the liberal elements in Italy and Spain. They also considered helping Spain to return to power in South America, where a number of republics had recently declared their independence. In addition, Russia's presence in Alaska worried both Britain and the United States. Using a trading post in Alaska as a base, Russian seal hunters had spread southward and established a trading post in San Francisco. British and U.S. leaders decided they had a common interest in protecting the North and South America from possible aggression by European powers. So you're getting a lot of restored monarchies in France, Austria, and Prussia, as well as you're getting suppression of liberal elements in Italy and Spain. So what the United States and Britain's concerned is that these European monarchies are going to go ahead and restore some of their power and perhaps develop more of their colonies into the Western Hemisphere in the Americas, right? Fear of Russian influence in Alaska and, of course, Spanish influence in South America. British initiative. British naval power determined the Spanish from attempting to come back in Latin America, but to maintain British trade with the Latin American republics required diplomacy. British Foreign Secretary George Canning proposed to Richard Rush, the U.S. minister in London, a joint Anglo-American warning to the European powers not to intervene in South America. So the British are just concerned about Latin American comeback of the Spanish. So British and America are going to work together to, of course, prevent that from happening. American response. Monroe and most of his advisors thought Canning's ideas of a joint declaration made sense. However, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams disagreed. He believed that a joint action with Britain would restrict U.S. opportunities for further expansion in the hemisphere. Adams reasoned as follows: If the United States acted alone, Britain could not be counted upon to stand behind the U.S. policies. 2, no European power could risk going to war in South America, and if it did, the British Navy would surely defeat the aggressor. And President Monroe decided to act as Adams advised, to issue a statement to the world that did not have Britain as a co-author. So President Monroe is basically, John Quincy Adams is saying that co-authoring this is going to restrict our influence in the Western Hemisphere and the Americas. So it's better that we go at this alone. Basically saying that regardless of whether or not Britain co-authors this, is people aren't going to try to go and expand in the Western Hemisphere because they fear Britain's Navy. So the Monroe Doctrine is written. On December 2, 1823, President Monroe inserted into his annual message to Congress a declaration of U.S. policy towards Europe and Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, as it came to be called, asserted as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonizations by any European powers. So basically saying that the Americas are not to be colonized by European powers, both North and South America. Monroe declared further the United States opposed attempts by European power to interfere in the affairs of any republic in the Western Hemisphere. So basically saying Europe, stay out of our hemisphere. The impact. Monroe's, but at the same time, of course, America will stay out of European entanglements and affairs. Impact. Monroe's bold words of nationalistic purpose were applauded by the American public, but soon forgotten as most citizens were more concerned with domestic issues. In Britain, Canning was annoyed by a doctrine because he recognized it applied not just to other European nations, but also to his country as well. The British too were warned not to intervene and not to seek new territory in the Western Hemisphere. The European monarchs reacted angrily to Monroe's message. Still, they recognized that their purposes were thwarted not by his words, but by the might of the British Navy. So although Great Britain did agree with us, they were kind of upset about it because they too could then not necessarily colonize any territories, and they would need to stay out of American policies, both North and Latin America. However, we had Britain's protection. Right, Britain did not want those other monarchies to expand westward. The Monroe Doctrine had less significance at the time than in later decades. In fact, to be honest, most Latin American countries didn't even know about it. when it would be hailed by politicians and citizens as the cornerstone of U.S. policy towards Latin America. In the 1840s, President James Polk was the first of many presidents to justify his foreign policy by referring to Monroe's warning words. So this comes up numerous times in history again. A national economy. In the early 1800s, the Jeffersonian dream of a nation of independent farmers remained strong in rural areas. As the century progressed, however, an increasing percentage of the American people were swept in dynamic economic changes of the Industrial Revolution. Political conflicts over tariffs, internal improvements, and the Bank of the United States were reflecting the importance of people's lives as a national economy that was rapidly growing. So there's a reason why this economy is growing. First thing is population growth. Population growth provided both the laborers and consumers required in industrial development. Between 1800 and 1825, the U.S. population doubled in the following 25 years. It then doubled again. A high birth rate accounted for most of this growth, but it was strongly supplemented after 1830 by immigrants arriving from Europe, particularly from Great Britain and Germany. The non-white population, African Americans and American Indians, grew despite the ban on the importation of slaves after 1808. However, as a percentage of the total population, non-whites declined from almost 20% in 1790 to 15% in 1850s. So you're getting a growing African American and American. You're basically getting a growing African American population this time, although slavery was illegal, or just slave trade was illegal. By the 1830s, almost one-third of the population lived west of the Alleghenies. At the same time, both old and new urban areas were growing rapidly. Transportation. Vital to the development of both the national and industrial colony was an efficient network of interconnecting roads and canals for moving people, raw materials, and manufacturing goods. Roads. There were a lot of roads. The turnpike was built in the 1790s, connected Philadelphia into the rich farmlands across Lancaster. Its success stimulated the construction of other privately built and relatively short toll roads that by the mid-1820s connected most of the country's major cities. Despite the need for interstate roads, states' rights blockers blocked the spending of federal funds on internal improvements. Constructions of highways across the state lines was therefore unusual. One notable exception was the National Cumberland Road, a paved highway with major route to the west extending more than 1,000 miles. From Maryland to Illinois, it began in 1811 and was completed in the 1850s, using both federal and state money, with the different states receiving ownership of segments of the highway. So in other words, one thing you understand about roads is during this time, most of these were state funded, so that means that there was a lack of continuity because people were concerned about state rights. They didn't want the federal money to create these improvements, which seems kind of ridiculous, but they felt it would give the federal government too much power. The Cumberland Road was the only exception. Canals. The completion of the Erie Canal in New York State in 1825 was a major event in linking the economies of western farms and eastern cities. The success of this canal in stimulating economic growth touched on a frenzy of canal building in other states. In a little more than a decade, canals joined together all the major lakes and rivers of the Mississippi. Improved the transportation meant lower food prices in the east, and most immigrants settling in the west, and stronger economic ties with the two sections. So think about your market revolution presentations here. The canal is very important because it connected all the major rivers and lakes, or not all, but most of them, which allowed for better trade. Steamboats. The age mechanized steam power travel began in 1807 with the successful voyage of the Hudson River to the Clermont. A steamboat developed by Robert Fulton, commercially operated steamboat lines, soon made round-trip shipping on the nation's great rivers both faster and cheaper. So a steamboat, think about this in terms of shipping, trade upstreams, definitely in rivers, was something that was a lot for population growth as well as economic growth. And of course, we're getting railroads, even more rapid and reliable links between the cities, possible with the building of the first railroads in the late 1820s. The early railroads were hampered at first by safety problems, but by 1830s, they were competing directly with the canals, an alternative method for carrying passengers and freight. The combination of railroads with other major improvements in transportation rapidly changed small western towns such as Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, and Chicago into booming commercial centers. So railroads, they compete a lot with canals and those steamboats. There were a lot of issues in terms of safety, but eventually this would become the major form of transportation. Growth of industry. At the start of the 19th century, a manufacturing economy had barely begun in the United States. By mid-century, however, the U.S. manufacturing surpassed agricultural in value. And by century's end, it was the world's leader. This industrial growth was a result of a unique combination of factors. So we're getting a lot of these inventions that would lead to the growth of industry. We're getting a lot of mechanical inventions. Protected by patent laws, inventors look for forwards to handsome rewards if their ideas for new tools or machines proved practical. You're getting Eli Whitney was only the most famous of hundreds of Americans whose long hours of tinkering in workshops resulted in improved technology. Besides inventing the cotton gin, he also developed a interchangeable parts for the making of rifles. Um, yeah, for making rifles. That's what you got to know about Eli Whitney: cotton gin and interchangeable parts, which should be very important for as a cause, but also as a practice for the Civil War. Corporations for raising capital. In 1811, New York passed a law that made it easier for businesses to raise capital by selling shares of stock. Other states soon imitated New York's example. Owners of corporations risked only the amount of money that they invested in the venture. Changes in the state corporation laws facilitated the rising of large sums of capital necessary for building factories, canals, and railroads. So you're getting, of course, people that are investing in stocks for these companies. The factory system, very important. Samuel Slater emigrated from Britain, and he took with him his secrets of building cotton spinning machines, and he put this knowledge to work by establishing the first U.S. factory in 1791. Early next century, the embargo of the War of 1812 stimulated domestic manufacturing and protected tariffs, and enacted by Congress to help new factories prosper. So think about Samuel Slater. He stole the factory plans, or not stole, he smuggled the factory plans to America, which would lead to the development of textile mills. In the 1820s, New England emerged as the country's leading manufacturer as a result of the abundant water power for driving the new machinery and excellent seaports for shipping goods. Also, the decline of New England's maritime industry made capital available for manufacturing, while declining of farming in the region yielded a ready labor supply. Other northern states with similar resources and problems, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, followed New England's lead. As the factory system expanded, it encouraged growth of financial businesses such as banking and insurance. So the manufacturing, the factory industry is going to lead to other industries. And this happens a lot in New England territory because, of course, all of the rivers and, the seaports. Labor. At first, the factory owners had difficulty finding workers for their mills. Factory life cannot compete with the lure of cheap land in the West. In response to this difficulty, textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, recruited young farm women, housed them in the company dormitories. In the 1830s, other factories imitated the Lowell system, and many factories also made extensive use of child labor. So towards the middle of the century, northern manufacturers began to employ immigrants in large numbers. So a lot of these workers were women, children, as well as immigrants, because you could pay them very cheap wages. As a result of this, you would start to get the first unions that would form, although that they were many of them outlawed. Unions were organized in major cities as early as the 1790s, increased in number as the factory system took hold. Many skilled workers had to seek employment in factories because the earlier practice could no longer compete with lower priced mass-produced hours. Long hours, low pay, poor working conditions led to widespread discontent among factory workers. A prime goal of the early union was to reduce the workday of 10 hours. The obstacles to union success, however, were many. The obstacles to union success, however, were many. Number one, immigrant replaced workers. Two, state laws outlawing unions. And three, frequent economic depressions with high unemployment. So basically saying there was not a lot of success for these unions early on. Commercial agriculture. In the early 1800s, farming became more of a commercial enterprise and less of a means of providing subsistence for the family. This change to crops was brought about by a blend of factors: cheap land and easy credit. Large areas of Western land were made available at low prices by the federal government. State banks also made it easy to acquire land, providing farmers with loans at low interest rates. During this time, it was very easy for people to obtain land. Markets. Initially, Western farmers were limited to sending their products down to Ohio and Mississippi rivers to southern markets. The advent of canals and railroads opened new markets to the growing cities of the Far East. So, as I stated earlier, um, these railroads and canals made trade and very easy. Cotton in the South. Throughout the 19th century, the principal cash crop in the South was cotton. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 transformed the agriculture of an entire region. Now they could easily separate the cotton fiber from the seed. Southern planters found cotton more profitable than tobacco and indigo, the leading crops of the colonial period. They invested their capital in the purchase of slaves in new land in Alabama and Mississippi and shipped most of their cotton crop overseas for sale to British textile factories. So, cotton gin obviously made it easier to go ahead and separate the cotton, which was in very high demand from Great Britain. So, you're getting the because the southern economy developed very rapidly. Effects of the market revolution. Specialization on the farm, growth of cities, industrialization, and development of the modern capitalism meant the end of self sufficient households and a growing interdependence among women. The changes combined to bring about a revolution in the marketplace. The farmers fed the workers in cities, who in turn provided farm families with an array of mass produced goods. For most Americans, the standard of living increased. At the same time, however, they were adapting to an impersonal, fast changing economy, presented challenging problems. So, although the economy was definitely doing very well, standard of living was going up, there are many issues that have come up, such as women and economic social mobility. So, let's talk about the issue. As American society became more urban, industrialized, nature of work and family changed for women, many of whom no longer worked next to their husbands on family farms. Women seeking employment in the city were usually limited to two choices. Number one, domestic service or teaching. Factory jobs, as in the Lao system, were not common. The overwhelmingly majority of women were single. If they married, they left their jobs and took up duties in the home. In both urban and rural settings, women were gaining relatively more control over their lives. Marriages arranged by by one's parent were less common, and some of the women elected to have fewer children. Nevertheless, legal restrictions on women remained. For example, they could not vote. So, as a result of the market revolution, this was changing the family structure, which became a challenge for both men and women. Some men did not, the majority of men did not accept it, but at the same time, more and more women wanted to challenge it. Economic and social mobility. Real wages improved for most urban workers in the 1800s. But the gap between the very wealthy and the very poor increased. Social mobility, which means moving up and down by income level, did occur from one generation to the next. And economic opportunities in the United States were greater than Europe. Extreme examples of poor, hardworking people becoming millionaires, however, were very rare. So there's just a lack of social mobility. Standard of living went up, but it was very difficult to actually move up and become rich and wealthy if you were someone that was poor. The issue of slavery. At the outset of the 19th century, many people throughout the nation believed and hoped that slavery would gradually disappear. They thought that the exhaustion of soil in the coastal lands of Virginia and Carolinas and the constitutional ban on the importation of slaves after 1808 would make slavery economically unfeasible. However, the rapid growth of the cotton industry and expansion of slavery in new states such as Alabama and Mississippi, and in hopes for the end of slavery. As the arguments over Missouri Compromise suggested, slavery easily defied answers. So the slavery of issues, the North thought it would die out with the stopping of the slave trade. However, because of the cotton gin, more and more slaves were needed. So I'm just going to do a quick review here of Chapter 8 and also look at our cheat sheet. So a couple things, the era of good feelings. Was it really an era of good feelings? Yes, to some extent. You're getting this one-party political system that existed, but do understand that there was still a lot of debate that went on, debates over slavery, debates over the National Bank. James Monroe viewed be the first president of the era of good feelings. Cultural nationalism and economic nationalism. So during this time of peace and prosperity politically, you're getting the rise of nationalism in American culture, paintings, artwork. Those are some of the things. Economic nationalism, more tariffs are being put into place, right? Support American-made manufactured goods that existed because of the tariffs that were on Great Britain and France prior to this. Henry Clay's American system, that's very important to know. No, of course. Three things he wanted to do: create a national bank, tariffs, as well as also um, public funding of federal government funding of projects and roads and canals. He was not able to necessarily be successful in the last one because of states' rights. Right, a lot of states, although they would always appreciate the money, but they felt it was up to them to fund these and create these works, not the federal government. Panic of 1819, you're getting a recession as a result of investment of land. The government let out all these loans, but of course the land didn't necessarily do as well as they had hoped, right? The Democratic Republican Party would then go ahead and take and accept some of the changes and become more federalist, right? Missouri Compromise. One thing you understand about this, there's a lot of reason for westward movement. Number one, both Jackson as well as William Henry Harrison acquired a lot of land from Native Americans, so now people want to move westward in it. Economic pressures, as well as improved transportation. There was a pressure to go ahead and settle in these new lands because a lot of the older land wasn't necessarily doing as well for farming, for example. It had been depleted. Improved transportation, you're getting the railroad, the turnpike, the canal, right? All this allowing us to move westward. You're also getting a lot of immigrants coming in during this time. The Missouri Compromise. So one of the main issues going through this was slavery. So the Missouri Compromise goes ahead and establishes that Maine would be a free state, Missouri would be a slave state, because the issue was that there was we didn't want an imbalance in terms of representation in Congress. So we'd add two states. However, everything north of the 3630 line would be free. Anything south would be a slave state, right? So Florida. So one thing you want to understand is Andrew Jackson. He goes ahead and Spain had acquired Florida, but the biggest issue was you're getting a lot of fugitives, outlaws, Native Americans that were settling into Florida, and that was, I guess you could say, a threat to America. So Jackson goes ahead and invades, and eventually what ends up happening is Spain decides to sell us Florida because they felt as if that they were going to lose it anyways. In return for this, we would go ahead, and this is Florida Purchase Treaty, we go ahead and, of course, say that we respect our claims in Texas, that's Spain's claims. Monroe Doctrine, right? Basically, Europe stay out of the West, Western Hemisphere, right? That's the main thing you want to make sure that you understand about this. So I did go over all of these to go back to your market revolution, the importance of all of these roads. They were mostly state funded, right? Canals. This would develop a lot of cities, and that's the reason why, because of the creation of these canals, a lot of access to rivers. And with the development of the steamboat, right, you're allowed to access these rivers. You're able to trade more consistently. The railroad would also lead to further trade. The main issue in the railroad, though, is remember that there were a lot of safety issues. But once those were resolved, that became the main form of transportation as well as trade. Other inventions that you need to make sure that you know. So in terms of corporations raising capital, of course, some of these corporations were based off of just different stocks. So people would invest their money in it, and if the company failed, big deal, you lose your investment. But if it did well, then you're going to go ahead and gain significant income. Getting the factory system from Samuel Slater, he brought his plans over from Great Britain. Then he would set up the modern textile mill, I guess you could say. Labor were mostly women, immigrant, and children because you could pay them lower prices. Unions were not necessarily that successful at this time. It would not be until the second industrial revolution as well as progressive movement where they would be able to obtain more rights. The biggest thing they were fighting for was a 10-hour workday. Commercial agriculture, a couple things that you want to make sure you know is the cotton gin. The cotton gin would be, of course, it was very easy to buy cheap land. Banks were loaning out this land. But cotton gin was the most significant part of this, right? This would affect the role of women because women this would be the first time they were not working side by side by their husband. They were actually working individually or with other groups of women, which was kind of advocating them to have more of a role in society, right? Economic and social mobility, there was a lack of it that existed. Slavery, although the North thought that it would kind of just go away after the abolishment of the slave trade, that did not happen. Didn't happen at all, right? So those are the main things that you want to make sure. And the issue with slavery, of course, is Every time we add a state, what's going to happen? It's going to be slave or free state. So, of course, going through this, the main thing that you want to make sure you understand here is the Monroe Doctrine. This is a must, which I discussed, basically stay out of the West, America. We also went over here the American system, Henry Clay, Erie Canal, railroads, steamboats, the national road. Those are not necessarily a lot of national roads that existed. American system, I went over Erie Canal, of course, would lead to the development of major cities in the East Coast because of trade. Steamboats, although they did move very slow, they allowed you to move up and downstream. National road, most of these roads are state funded. However, you did have a road that would go from Illinois all the way to Maryland, and different states would kind of develop their own components of it. Telegraph allowed for long distance communication, but typically for the rich and the wealthy. Cotton gin made it easier to go ahead and, of course, pick cotton at expanded rates, but this would also lead to wanting more plantation land. And, of course, you're getting the factory system by Samuel Slater, which I discussed. So those are the main things that you want to make sure that you understand for this.